What we really want to know is, why did Cervantes write this novel? What was the context of the Spain in which that novel was produced? And what was this great writer trying to tell us? And he is, if you read the novel carefully, trying to tell us many things. That the Spain in which he is writing is a Spain in which the three cultures that coexisted for several hundred years have been destroyed. As many of you, I hope, will know, that for several hundred years, Islamic culture, Jewish culture, Christian culture coexisted, debated. Out of these debates and discussions, a synthesis grew which was called Al-Andalus and Al-Andalusian culture, Al-Andalusian poetry, Al-Andalusian philosophy, which they feared in Baghdad as being too radical and too questioning. But it was an amazing civilization in many ways. And this civilization was destroyed. Two key years, one 1492, which people mainly think about the discovery of America by Columbus. But the other thing that that year marked was the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. That's when they proclaimed that all the Jews had to be expelled, and they were told, either you convert or you get out of our country. And if you convert, and we find that you are still observing your ritual, religious rituals, then that means that you have betrayed your new religion and we will burn you. And in order to make sure that this happens, we have created a secret police called the Holy Brotherhood, which will spy on you quite openly to see whether you're observing these rituals or not. And exactly the same was done to the Spanish Muslims. And it's now easy to forget because views and anger on Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is so great. But you have to remember that for most of that history, Jewish and Islamic civilizations coexisted, both in the Arab world and in Al-Andalus, Spain and Portugal, and in Sicily. And the Muslims were the ruling class, but they protected the Jews. There were no pogroms in Sicily. They were protected. Very few attacks in Andalus in over 600 years. There were some, but by and large, very few. And this coexistence created a very rich culture. And when that culture was destroyed by force, by the reconquest of Spain, as the Catholic Church called it, and the armies it created to fight it, these two civilizations were rooted out. And what was said to the Jews in 1492 was said to the Muslims 60 years later. Convert or get out. And if you convert, but you're not a proper convert, we see you having a bath 3 times a day, you will be killed. It's quite ironic that, but bathing became a crime in Spain because Muslims had these ritual baths. All the public baths were destroyed to stop it, city after city after city. So the fate of these two civilizations was together, and this is the period in which Cervantes was born and was growing up. And all the evidence points to the fact that he belonged to a family of Jewish doctors, physicians from Cordoba. But they converted, you know, his grandparents converted to save themselves and because they didn't want to leave the country. So they converted, but even in the families of converts and conversos, many of those old traditions never died, Muslim or Jew, never died. And so when Cervantes sat down to write this novel, what does he say? It's very interesting. In the early pages of the novel, he says basically that it's not a novel written by him. And the reader gets a shock And he then says, one day, when I was in the Alcana market in Toledo, a boy came by to sell some notebooks and old papers to a silk merchant. As I am very fond of reading, even torn papers in the streets, every reference point, torn papers in the streets, because lots of literature, documents written in Arabic, often when they were found, were torn up and chucked in the streets. As I am very fond of reading even torn papers in the streets, I was moved by my natural inclination to pick up one of the volumes the boy was selling, and I saw that it was written in characters I knew to be Arabic. And since I recognized but could not read them, I looked around to see if some Morisco, Muslim, convert, who knew Castilian and could read them for me, was in the vicinity. And it was not very difficult to find this kind of interpreter, for even if I had sought a speaker of a better and older language, I would have found him. And the better and older language for Cervantes is the language of his forebears, Hebrew. So he's making 2 points. He's giving a hint to the reader, this is where I'm coming from, and this novel actually has been written in Arabic. Now, why does he say this? It's not for amusement. It's not to make us smile. It's to register a literary protest that once we had a culture in which these languages flourished, and these languages are no longer there. And later on, in the novel, when he's talking to Sancho Panza, all this is seen as comedy, by the way, in most Western eyes. It's very serious stuff. He's explaining to Sancho Panza what the word albogues means, as in, well, and what if in the midst of all this music, albogues should resound? What are albogues? Said Sancho. I've never heard of them or seen them in my life. Albogues, responded Don Quixote, are something like brass candlesticks, and when you hit one with the other along the empty or hollow side, it makes a sound that is not unpleasant, though it may not be very beautiful or harmonious, and it goes well with the rustic nature of pipes and timbrels. This word, albogues, is Moorish, i.e. Arabic, as are all those in our Castilian tongue that begin with al. For example, al-Mohaza, al-Morzar, al-Hamra, al-Guasil, al-Husima, al-Masin, al-Kansia, and other similar words. I have told you this in passing because it came to mind when you mentioned albogues. But there is nothing in Cervantes that is just told in passing. He's covering himself here because of the Inquisition. Nothing is told in passing. Everything is carefully thought about before it is put on paper. And this Inquisition in Spain, which destroyed an entire culture, went very deep in this guy. And throughout this novel, which if you read it and read it with intelligence and know the history of Spain, you will find what he is doing. I think, probably alone in this, but my reading of Cervantes' novel says that the real target of the novel is the Catholic Church. And he does it in a very special way because were this to be openly admitted, he would have been killed. I mean, he would have been tried for heresy, blasphemy, and put to fire. That's what they used to do. So he's very careful the way he writes it. And all the books of chivalry that he attacks at the beginning of this novel, I don't believe he's talking about books of chivalry, really. He's talking about useless books, and many of these useless books were religious catechisms and religious books that were being produced in Spain to justify the Inquisition and justify the expulsions of Muslims and Jews from Spain. So the novel, in other words, in this case, is replete with history. And that is what makes it, curiously enough, a world historical novel. Because his readers knew exactly what he was talking about. Suddenly, he and Sancho Panza are going through Spain, and there's an empty village. And they say, this village is empty. I wonder who lived here. They know perfectly well who lived there. Muslims, who have now gone back to the Maghreb. But he mentions it. He could have ignored it, after all. Everyone knew. But he wanted to say to his readers, look, this is what has happened to our country. So Cervantes' great novel, probably the first great piece of world literature as such, is in itself a synthesis of the different cultures of which Spain has been a part. And he expresses this in the novel very clearly, and he wants everyone to know. And that is what makes this book so special, and that is how this book really should be read. And read it on your own and see. And if you read it with an understanding of what had happened in Spain, it's quite amazing. And that is the effect it had on the German Enlightenment. Schiller, for instance, when he is writing his depiction of Philip II, in his famous play, which has been made into an opera, Don Carlos, but it was written as a play, Friedrich Schiller writes this amazing scene where the king is nervous that his son is plotting a rebellion. So he says, the king, my son, the king of Spain, the king, my son is meditating treason, Grand Inquisitor. Well, and what do you resolve? King, on all or nothing. Grand Inquisitor, what mean you by this all? King, he must escape or die. Grand Inquisitor, well, sire, decide. King, and can you not establish some new creed to justify the bloody murder of one's only son? Grand Inquisitor, to appease eternal justice, God's own Son expired upon the cross. It's chilly, but everything and anything can be justified by inquisitors and inquisitions, is what Schiller is saying. And of course, it has been justified ever since. And this debate will not go away, the debate around Cervantes, for a very simple reason, that when he wrote the book, of course, it was a different type of Europe. But that expulsion created the modern European identity. It went very deep in Europe. A Catholic Christian identity. All the other cultures, religions had to be exterminated. And that created the modern European identity. And it's important to remember this, to understand even how deep this goes when we read about the wave of Islamophobia now in virtually every single European country, with the big target of attack in most of European countries are Muslim migrants. They don't just attack them as migrants, they attack them because of their origins, their religious origins, their cultural origins. And the Chancellor of Germany says openly that we can never integrate with the Turks, German Turks, many born in that country, because of who they are and where they come from. They are the other. She more or less said that, Angela Merkel, a few weeks ago. And no one even bothered to comment on it. So the point I make often is that the language being used about Muslims in many parts of Europe today is very similar. Not the same, but very similar to much of what was said about Jews in the 20s and 30s and 40s. They wear funny clothes, they come from a different civilization, they are not like us, they are Jews, they killed Christ, they have Christ's blood on their hands, they have a different diet, they pray on a different day. We can never actually integrate them because in the last analysis, their culture, their roots are very different to ours. Anti-Semitic currents and thought in Europe goes back many, many centuries. It didn't suddenly develop with Hitler and the Third Reich, who took it to its ultimate grisly conclusion, but it had existed for a long time. And so Cervantes' novel is not unimportant for trying to understand what Europe once was. That is his plea. Look at what we have lost when we lost these different cultures that also humanized us. And it's an important novel to understand.